Okay, folks, please take your seats. Er den på? Nei, jeg kan ikke, så det må stå sånn. Nei. Everybody got their coffees and sandwiches? Okay, almost. Then I'd like to wish you a warm welcome to this seminar on the situation in Belarus and its relation to the war in Ukraine. The seminar is organized by Solidaritet med Belarus, Solibel, in partnership with the Green Party in the parliament. And my name is Rasmus Hansson. I'm a parliamentarian on the Committee for Business and Industry for the Green Party. Now, it's extremely encouraging to see that so many of you have decided to attend this seminar, obviously because there's going to be interesting information and the issue is extremely important. And therefore, I'll obviously wish an extremely warm welcome to our main keynote speaker, Mr. Andrei Sannikov, who is, as you probably know, a true hero in the struggle of democracy and justice in Belarus. He's a former diplomat. He's a vice foreign minister, or used to be. He used to be a candidate in the presidential elections, and he has seen the insides of Lukashenko's prisons and torture chambers. He has come to this seminar from his exile in Warsaw, so we're very honored to have you here, Andrei. A report published last week by the United Nations Human Rights Office documented severe violations of international human rights law committed by the Lukashenko regime. According to the Commissioner of Human Rights, the report paints an unacceptable picture of impunity and near total destruction of civic space and fundamental freedoms in Belarus. And this repression of civil and political liberties makes it impossible for civil society, for the media, for political parties to operate in the country. The Lukashenko regime is dependent on the Putin regime. It's a strong ally of Russia in the aggression against Ukraine. And Lukashenko has, as we all know, allowed Russia to use Belarusian territory and airspace in his aggression against Ukraine. This is, of course, completely unacceptable. And it's also important to remember that this means that the freedom of the Ukrainian people is also closely linked the freedom of the people in Belarus is also closely linked to the freedom of the people in Ukraine, and then again closely linked to the future of Europe. So for those of us who have been very concerned with the situation in Ukraine and not quite as attentive to the situation in Belarus, it is important to understand these links. The people in Belarus in their own right deserves freedom, as all peoples in the world and all peoples in Europe, but their fate is also our fate in many ways. Later today, there's going to be a debate in the parliament over the address of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which was given yesterday. And I am going to raise this issue, the issue of Belarus, the need to be more attentive to, first of all, the rights of the people of Belarus, and secondly, the link between the fate of the people of Belarus and the fate of Ukraine and of Europe in Norway's foreign policy. we need to discuss to what extent Norway can take more ambitious positions in cooperation with the EU on sanctions and on other measures that can help the the Belarusian people forward in their struggle for freedom. This will be more dealt with in more detail by the people who are coming after me in the seminar. And I will now leave the floor to Mr. Arve Hansen, who will be chairing the rest of the seminar. Mr. Hansen works as an advisor for the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. He's done research in Belarus, in Ukraine, and in Russia. And he knows the Russia-Ukraine conflict intimately. So please, Arve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Hansson, and thank you particularly to the Green Party and the Solidarity with Belarus Association for arranging this seminar. As you've mentioned, I work in the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and my day-to-day job is to document war crimes in the Documentation and Accountability Hub. But we also document human rights violations and crimes against humanity, and we see, unfortunately, a lot of instances of crimes against humanity and human rights violations in Belarus. And as you've mentioned, I have that academic background from studying Belarus and who the Belarusians are and the protest movements of Belarus. So I'm really honored to be invited to chair this panel on Belarus. So we all know that the situation in Belarus is horrible. We know that Lukashenka has built this powerful police state over almost 29 years. There are immense repressions against human rights activists, against politicians, against whomever Lukashenka might deem a possible or real enemy of the regime. So but we all know these things. So today I would like us and the panelists, if possible, to move the discussion into 4 directions. First of all, it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts about what is going on in Belarus today, within civil society, in politics, relations between Belarus and Moscow and Kyiv and so on, and what role Belarus plays in the ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. The second topic for today would be nice if we could talk about the plausible scenarios for Belarus. What may happen tomorrow, in a year, in 2 years, or in 5 years? Thirdly, and this is kind of a provocative question, why should we bother about what is going on in Belarus? What is the link between Belarus and the region and Norway? And the fourth question is perhaps the most important. What are the possible solutions to the human rights violations, and what part could Belarus play to end the war and perhaps also the regimes in Moscow and Minsk? So we have 4 panelists today, each with their own perspective on Belarus, 1 politician, 1 military expert, and 2 young activists. We started a little bit later today, and we only have until approximately 10 o'clock. So I'll ask the speakers to keep their time limits and preferably keep it short. So I would like to introduce now Sannikau, who's a very interesting person. Hansson just gave you some information about him, but he's seen the inside of the political systems in the Soviet Union under the first Belarusian head of state, Stanislav Shushkevich, and Aljaksandr Lukasjenka. And he's been a vocal part of the opposition since the mid-1990s. He was one of the organizers behind the Charter 97 group. He was a part of the presidential campaign of Milinkevich in 2006. And he himself ran as a presidential candidate in 2010, for which he was brutally attacked and imprisoned. So, Andrei Alehovich, you have 30 minutes. The floor is yours. Wherever you like.
Morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the Solibel and Green Party for organizing this, and personally to Rasmus and Audin. It is really a very important moment and an important occasion for me to present the views from inside Belarus, although I live in exile, but I live for Belarus, and I'm in daily contact with Belarusians, with my friends, with my colleagues, not only living in exile, but also in Belarus. So I will try to answer the 4 questions, or follow the directions that are mapped. What's going on in Belarus today? The situation in Belarus today is the consequence of ignorance of the processes that were developing in Belarus for a long time by the democratic world, by the Western world. Because we have a full-fledged dictatorship, very brutal dictatorship, which is waging the war, undeclared war against the people of Belarus. We have the war of Russia against Ukraine, which is the real war and horrible war. And we have the undeclared war of Lukashenko regime against the people in Belarus, which will inevitably resign in the collapse of this regime. But today is probably the most difficult moment, because never had European country had such a number of political prisoners as Belarus has today. It is more than 5,000. It's about, according to some calculates, it's about 6,000 political prisoners. And these people are not kept in prison. They're being killed in prison. They're being tortured. And it is all happening without seemingly any leverage that is available for the people in Belarus, and very little leverage which is being applied towards Belarus from outside. What is happening today in Belarus, again, to answer the first question, is the aggression against Ukraine. Lukashenko was properly named co-aggressor by European Union, by United Nations, and he is, because he offered the territory of Belarus to the Kremlin aggressors, and from the military point of view, the territory is controlled by the Kremlin, not by Lukashenko today. From the military point of view, he might be pretending to take decisions on how to proceed with the war, but he is not. I doubt that he was even informed about the 24th of February, on the eve of the 24th of February. Why it is happening? Because, again, the world was too complacent about preparation of this war on the territory of Belarus, because the major military exercises that were in fact preparation for the offensive in Europe started in 2009. They were called Zapad, and they were the largest scale military exercises on the territory of the former Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then they repeated in 2011, 13, 17, and finally in 21. And it was clear that Russia was preparing an offensive, and the territory of Belarus was the key strategic territory for this offensive, because the price for Russia, for Kremlin, was Kiev and still is Kiev, and the only possibility to mount an offensive on Kiev and to capture, as were the plans of Russians, Kiev, was from the territory of Belarus. Unfortunately, all the signals, dangerous signals from the territory of Belarus were ignored. The only thing that was done, the NATO intensified its maneuvers, including closer to the borders, to its eastern borders, but that's it. Because even Ukraine didn't take it seriously. Even Ukraine, till even in 2020, when we had the largest protest in Belarus, considered Lukashenko to be a smart politician, very good manager, and for some time Lukashenko was the most popular foreign politician in Ukraine, among all Western politicians even. So I think that this kind of ignorance of Belarus, it is probably the answer to your third question, why it is important to Norway. Because the threat is not only to us with the regime of Lukashenko, and not only to the Ukraine with the war that Putin is waging with the help of Lukashenko. The threat is to Europe. The immediate threat is, and they feel it, is to our neighbors, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and then Europe in general, because Putin never conceals his plans. I think from time to time he reveals it, starting from his famous speech in Munich in 2007, that he wants to have his sphere of interest controlled by Kremlin, not only in the near abroad, as they used to call us, but also in Europe. He needs to deal with Europe country by country. He needs to negotiate on an individual basis with Germany, with France probably, and he tried to organize this kind of axis before. He doesn't need united Europe. He doesn't need united voice of Europe, of all European countries, no matter whether they're in European Union or not. So he will use all kinds of blackmail, and now he will use military means to fragment Europe if he is not stopped. So what are the possible scenarios for Belarus? I think that first of all, the precondition to the discussion of scenarios is please listen to Belarusians, listen to their position. Because now we are having the worst case scenario, which could have been avoided if we were listened to and some preventive measures were taken. I can give you a lot of examples when I spoke with presidents, prime ministers, ministers of foreign affairs of European countries, warning of them what would happen in Belarus, what would happen in 2010, for example. Somehow they all tended to believe Lukashenko, not their position. And they were talking to us with the language of Putin and Lukashenko, that we don't want to alienate Moscow. Lukashenko is in the control of the country. Opposition is weak and fragmented. There will be no protest. We are quite sure that Lukashenko is in full control, and you have no chances. Besides, you are fragmented. You don't have a single leader, and you are not united around a single leader. It is complete. It shows that the complete misunderstanding of the situation in Belarus and misunderstanding of the processes. So that is the prerequisites to discussing any possible scenario that is happening. And the possible scenario, I agree with Rasmus here, that it really closely tied to the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And I don't want to discuss the worst case scenario. We are having it today. Let's discuss more optimistic. Let's do everything to help Ukrainians, because not only we depend on this. The future of Europe depends on it. The future of the democratic world depends on it. We understand it very well. And that is why Belarusians are always there fighting with Ukrainians for their independence, for their freedom. And it is not, didn't start in 22, in February of 22. Because I might remind you that during the Maidan in 2014, the first Belarusian that was killed by the special forces in Ukraine was Belarusian. The first person killed was Belarusian, Mikhail Zhizhnevsky. We were with Ukrainians during Maidan 2004, during the Orange Revolutions, and there were hundreds of Belarusians in the streets protesting and helping Ukrainians to really achieve some changes in the falsified, during this period of falsified elections, when, after which Yushchenko managed to win clearly and honestly. And of course, we started, Belarusian volunteers started to fight on the Ukrainian territory with arms, not in 22, but in 2014, when Crimea was occupied and when Donbass and Donbass region was occupied. And they continue to fight. There are hundreds of Belarusian volunteers that know quite clearly that the future of Belarus depends on the victory of Ukraine. The future of Belarus and Ukraine depend on defeat of Russian Empire, because that's what we are fighting against today, the Russian Empire. And Lukashenko's regime, I repeat again and again, it is not a Belarusian regime. Lukashenko is a unique dictator in the world. I don't know any dictator in the world who would come to power denying national character, national history, national culture, national even language of Belarus. He came as Soviet internationalist, and he continues to be not only Soviet internationalist, but the complete Kremlin vassal, complete Kremlin puppet. So this is the dangerous union of dictators. We can continue also with other countries of the former Soviet Union that has to be defeated. And the key chairman, the chairman of this union or cooperative of dictators is Putin, of course, and Kremlin. So I would suggest that we concentrate on the best case scenario, how to help Ukraine, how to help Belarus to get rid of Lukashenko. And I'm an advocate of different logic, because people tend to say that, okay, Belarus will be freed when Kremlin, Putin's regime collapses, and Putin's regime is overthrown. I would say that Putin's regime will be overthrown when we deal with Lukashenko's regime, because that is the key military factor today. Putin still has plans for Kiev. It is not victory for him to reinforce and to strengthen his position in Donbass region. The price for him is Kiev. And Belarus is the natural springboard to get this prize for Putin. I think he will do everything, trying to negotiate, trying to stall for time, trying to buy some time for himself, maybe going for some intermediary ceasefire, but still he will be looking on options and chances to organize the real serious attack on Kiev from the Belarusian territory. So I think that is clear for us, and I would love to hear. I already hear this really sober voices of some analysts that we ignored Belarus for so long, and we now having the situation with the help of Belarus, the major war in Europe is being waged. So we have to really analyze in all seriousness what our mistakes in Belarus to deal with the whole situation of security breach in Europe. And what could be done, or what could be the option for Belarus? It was mentioned, and Rasmus, I think, mentioned the report of the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights, and that says that the report analyzes the period from May 2020 till, I think, the end of the year 2020. It is based on the testimony of 207 witnesses, direct testimonies, and the report claims that there are all grounds to call this behavior of Lukashenko's regime as the crime against humanity. So we have a moral and almost legal ground to react strongly to the activities of Lukashenko inside Belarus. And I think that it is no coincidence that International Criminal Court issued the warrant on Putin and UN produced the report. We are now having two criminals that are accused or charged with the crimes against humanity and war crimes that are waging war against Ukraine. So there are much more solid, much more grounds to react strongly to help, first of all, the people in Belarus, because frankly the situation is horrible and all the opportunities, people are deprived of any opportunities to defend themselves. They cannot even hire lawyers because if they are political prisoners, because lawyers are being arrested, as happened a couple of days ago with the lawyers of some very prominent names. So I think that it is morally justified, among all things, to demand immediate release of all political prisoners by European Union, by the West in general, and to introduce the strictest, the strongest sanctions to achieve this goal. I can tell this openly and publicly that if such a condition put, I will be the first. I'm known to be a strong supporter of strong sanctions. But if such a condition is put and sanctions are introduced, I'll be the first to welcome such a policy of the European Union and the West in general. Because people are not being kept in prisons, they're being killed. I'm repeating again and again. And the information that you are having from the press is nothing compared to what we are having of real situation with political prisoners in prisons. And people, there are people who are in need of the immediate and very urgent medical assistance. And they are put in the punishment cells and kept there incommunicado without any possibility to see even their lawyers, not to say about the family members. So I will not close my intervention. I will open this intervention with these major main points in my view, that today not much could be done inside Belarus to help people of Belarus that are rejecting this regime completely, and 2020 did demonstrate it very clearly. And all the leverage that could be used to the regime of Lukashenko is outside Belarus. And there are a lot of possibilities and there are a lot of opportunities and chances and leverages and instruments that could be used. Simply, it has to be the topic of very important discussion. Second, Belarus is the key factor in war against Ukraine. If this factor is removed as regime of Lukashenko, the victory will be within the reach. It will be much easier to achieve victory in Ukraine if there is no regime of Lukashenko. Third, the regime, Lukashenko's regime is keeping Belarus in such a state with the absence of reforms. I'm not even talking about democracy and human rights, with the absence of economic reforms, that Belarus will become a natural success story after it is liberated, and a natural example of how the reforms could be achieved, because it is manageable. It's much more manageable than Ukraine, you can admit it. And the third, I think that the dangers that come out of the former empire and the vestiges and remnants of the former totalitarian state on the territory of the former Soviet Union that don't have any examples of democracy. Of course, I'm not including, referring to Baltic states because it's a different story. They are not Soviet republics. So it is still, we still we have to deal with these dangers, otherwise the Russian and more aggressive empire will revive, and then the fate of Europe is not very bright. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sannikau. Please allow me to introduce our next speaker, which is Tom Røseth. He's an assistant professor at the Norwegian National Defence Staff College, and he's previously been a researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies. He holds a PhD in international politics and political science from the University of Oslo, and he's also studied Russian politics, society and language at the University of Bergen and the Moscow State Institute for International Relations. So you will, as I understand, carry on the discussion more in detail about the Belarus function in the ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. So thank you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Arve. And first, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to the Green Party and Solidaritet. I'm really happy to be here. And it's a very good introduction by Mr. Sannikau. Thank you. I want to agree on you totally on the issue of the Moscow ambition on gaining Kyiv and conquering Kyiv. They proved it in the initial phase of the war, and it's still the ambition from Moscow to do that. But the military ambition is adjusted according to the realities on the ground and the opposition and the very impressive defense that Ukrainians have managed to manifest. So it's the necessity of the war that has forced Moscow to adjust their policies or their war to the Donbass, but it's still the ambition to take Kyiv. And to take Kyiv, it was, as we remember, on the 24th of February last year, it was possible, and it was made possible by the Lukashenko regime. And I also want to remind you that this was very close. It was almost a success, and that has been, I would say, quite undercommunicated. It was close. They were on the outskirts of Kyiv, in the cities that we heard, or the like Bucha and Irpin and things, small outskirts of Kyiv, and they also almost managed to conquer or to control two important airfields north of Kyiv. That was the most known is the Hostomel airport. If Moscow had managed to have an air bridge to that location, they would have conquered Kyiv. But the Ukrainians managed to defend the airfield and throw the Russians out. And that was sort of that saved Kyiv, and the war would have been completely different if Kyiv had been taken. Then we would have possibly a capture of the political elite in Kyiv, and also more of a guerrilla war in Ukraine. So that's all of a different scenario. I also want to emphasize Lukashenko's regime's role during the war. He allowed this invasion to take place, almost capturing Kyiv, but also during the war, his territory and the Belarus territory has been used for constant missile attacks. A bit less of late, but that's in the initial phase of the war, and occasionally still it's used. I think around 700 missiles have been launched from the Belarus territory, and also the Belarus territory has been used for training Russian mobilized personnel. Around 5,000 to 10,000 of them. 5,000 is still left in Belarus. Belarus has also provided Russia with support in the war, tanks, armored vehicles, and ammunition. So we know that Russia has been having deficits on the material in this war, and Russia has provided. Now, Belarus has provided quite a lot of equipment to Russia. It also has, as I mentioned, trained some personnel and made them capable of through training operate in the war. Another important factor that Belarus has played in the war is that it has been a constant threat to Ukraine by having, well, one thing is the strong rhetoric from the president, but another is also the constant high preparedness exercises along the border to Ukraine. And this forces Ukraine to bind some of its forces up north. And that's makes it harder for Ukraine to prioritize. It needs to, for example, put maybe up to 20,000 military personnel along the northern border to safeguard it. Belarus offensive from the north is not probable at the moment, but there's a constant possible threat of an incident spinning off also there. Lukashenko said that just one Ukrainian soldier crossing the border will lead to a full war, and sort of set the stage for a possible false flag operation, or a small sort of incident could escalate the situation. But I don't think Belarus is interested in directly participating in the war. There's a lot of challenges inside Belarus that makes this less probable. But another aspect is also to what degree Belarus can change the facts on the ground. Belarus has around 50,000 standing forces. Around 10,000 of those are good trained, and that's not really a big difference in a war like this. But it of course it could complicate the situation for Ukraine, absolutely. But another push towards Kyiv is then if in such a scenario you would have to mobilize within Belarus, and that's been some indication of refreshing the mobilized draft lists but no proper mobilization. But that would be a sign for Belarus doing something serious, perhaps joining this war, which I don't think is that probable as of now. But Belarus has, well, I would say, as I mentioned, 10,000 capable forces. 5,000 of those are special forces, and the experience is not that great. But it's the 2020 uprising in Belarus. They had a role in fighting their own population, and also they have some training from international operations. So that's what they got. But for being such a small country, it's a big army. I want to emphasize that. So I think I'll end it with that. If we have a short time, and take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. We're now moving on to the second part of the seminar, where we will have a discussion. And we've now heard from kind of a view from the top. We've heard about the political implications of the war, what is going on, and the military situation in Ukraine, and how that affects Belarus, and how Belarus affects the military situation in Ukraine. But I'll now invite two young activists, two Belarusian activists. One is here, it's Maxim Zavransky. He is the international secretary of the Belarusian Students Association. He is responsible for advocacy and raising awareness of the problems of Belarusian students at an international level. During the post-election protests of 2020, he was one of the organizers of student strikes and demonstrations in Minsk, am I right? Yeah. And when he heard about the KGB doing a crackdown on organizers such as himself, in November 2020, he left Belarus, and he's now studying at the Students at Risk program here in Norway. And the other panelist is Nia Gladinkaya. She's a lawyer and human rights defender. In the summer of 2020, she was an exchange student at the University of Oslo, where she first arranged demonstrations in support of a democratic Belarus. And then she went to Belarus later that year to participate in and support the demonstrations there. She's now currently in southeastern Ukraine, where she's been. Well, she's been in Ukraine since March 2022, and among other things, she's providing legal and psychological help to Ukrainians. So, give a warm hand of applause to our two panelists. And I'll now sit down, and we'll have the discussion from here. Can you hear me from here as well? Yes. Okay, great. So I'll start with you two first. We've heard Andrei talk about the Lukashenka regime and its brutal repressions, and they didn't start in 2020. They've been ongoing since he came to power in 1994. So there have been several generations of opposition to Lukashenka, and it's more or less the same story, or at least similar results. People are going out in the streets. Yeah?
I think it's off.
It's off. And now?
Maybe you just use this for now.
Okay, I'll use this one. And could you hear me now? Yeah. And it's a similar story. People have gone out to protest in the streets, on squares, and they've been met with a brutal riot police. And so I'll ask you first, Maxim, what have you learned from previous generations of opposition to Lukashenka? And in 2020, did you know what to expect?
Well, during previous protests, I was a little kid, and I didn't really check what was going on. I knew that there was some protests. I knew that they ended quite fast, but in 2020, I would say that the tension in the society started much earlier than the election campaign. It started with the COVID, and it started with students, as I'm representative of students, and it started because students wanted remote study due to the COVID, and the government didn't want to implement this. And because of that, some student activists started some kind of protest against this decision, and they were expelled from universities, and this is where it started. This is one of the reasons why protests started in 2020. And in August, I would say that when we were talking with my friends before the 9th of August, we were discussing what will be happening, and I said that, oh, it will end so quickly and nothing will happen. There will be no protest because it used to be like that, and there is no evidence that anything would change now. But when the first days after the elections were, and there were some news of torches in the streets, of killing people, of big violence against the protesters, and there was no internet, I think that there was some kind of rage in the hearts of people, and they were thinking that, and they were thinking that probably it's time to start now. But I would say that it was more spontaneous, especially for students, because the academic year in Belarus starts on the 1st of September, and this is when the student protest against the results of elections started. And it was very spontaneous. We made so many mistakes. We didn't know what to expect. That's why so many people were arrested. So many students were arrested. And a lot of them are still in prison. They have huge charges. Some of them, like for example, student Marfa Rabkova, she has 14 years and 9 months of imprisonment in the penal colony. And it's only one of the at least 50 other examples of students. And if we speak about youth in general, I won't speculate on the numbers, but as far as I remember, around 45% of all political prisoners are youth. It means that from the 16 to 35 years old, and a lot of people went through administrative arrests. But I would say we were not really prepared for that protest because it was more emotional thing. We just started to do what we were thinking it's fine to do. That's why we made so many mistakes. That's why there are so many victims of that protest.
Thank you. Nia, thank you for joining us. Do you share Maxim's assessment of the 2020 protest movement? And why do young people choose to protest in Belarus? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Chiare, mine damer og herrer, thank you very much for inviting me here on this panel. I would like firstly provide some kind of appreciation for everyone who organized this meeting. I would like to say thank you for Green Party, Rasmus, and also I'm very honored to be on this panel with you and Mr. Sannikov. He was the only candidate for the presidency I've ever voted for, so I'm really very honored to be here. So according to Maxim's viewpoint, I can add that most likely the younger generation of Belarusians, they kind of like they never be in Soviet Union. The free democratic society is supposed to be operate. As for me, I used to study in Norway in University of Oslo because I know how democratic society is supposed to work. What is like really country for life in a real life situation is. And I really appreciate my time. I love Norwegian culture, Norwegian people, and I truly want that this kind of like Norwegian Scandinavian model in the future would be applied into Belarusian in the free Belarusian situation after the liberation of Belarus from Lukashenko's regime. So in some point, I would like to say that we must understand that Belarusians and Lukashenko, it's the same. Belarusian is not Lukashenko. Belarusians don't support his view, what he is doing, how he helping Putin's regime with all these atrocities, with all these war crimes, what he committed on the and his troops, Russian troops committed on the territory of Ukraine. Belarusians don't support it. I met a lot of helping Ukrainians from the beginning because they are against of the war, and they truly understand once Ukraine wins, and we are sure that Ukraine wins this war, Belarus would also be free. Since Putin's regime falls, Lukashenko regime falls simultaneously. I believe so. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm
sorry for interrupting. What I wanted also to say is that police can proceed to support Ukraine. I understand that the war is it would be set long, and you most likely you're tired, exhausted, and you're thinking about your every daily basis routine. But the war is still in the country. Like civilian people are dying. Young military Ukrainians are dying on the front line every day. Like every day I lost my acquaintances, friends lose friends on the front line. So please proceed to help Ukraine. Don't forget, it's important for everyone. Ukraine now stands in between Europe and Russia.
Thank you.
Don't let Ukraine be on their own.
So I would like to have one more question about the 2020, the wave of protests in 2020 in Belarus. As you know, there were hundreds of thousands of demonstrators out in the streets, not only in Minsk, but in virtually every major city and village across the country, which is unprecedented for Belarus. So you had that wide national movement for change. How did the Lukashenko regime survive the 2020 protest wave? And perhaps we'll start with Andrei and Tom. Your thoughts about that.
Actually, what Maxim said is very important because he presented the view that is shared by many in Belarus and was shared before 2020, that it was spontaneous, it was unexpected, we didn't know what to do. It was not spontaneous. It didn't start with COVID. After the crackdown in 2010 and the non-existent election in 2015, when we boycotted the election because our friend and colleague Nikolai Statkevich was in prison, and we thought it immoral to take part in any kind of political campaign. We saw the first major protest in Belarus in 2017, and it was the most massive protest since perestroika times, and it was connected with the so-called decree on social parasites, when people revolted, and the protests were held in 20 towns and cities of Belarus. Again, I must underline, it was the first major protest after the times of perestroika that covered almost the whole territory of Belarus, and we knew that it was coming. We knew that 2020 will be the year of revolution. And we were preparing ourselves, and unfortunately, many people thought that it will be easy to go to streets and that's it. Like many people saw it as a carnival time, as a festival time. We knew that the fight will be very tough, very brutal from the side of regime, but unfortunately the incompetence of those who were leading the protest led to the failure of the protest. And I think that it was the best window of opportunity that we had. We had some windows before, but 2020 was the best window of opportunity. The failure, first of all, is inside Belarus, but a lot was done mistakenly by the West. And first of all, the sanctions were not introduced immediately. Even in 2010, when I was in prison, the sanctions against the regime were introduced in 2 months. It took European Union more than half a year to start discussing serious sanctions. So, but again, I don't want to sound gloomy. Yes, the protest is stifled. The people are arrested every day, detained, tortured, beaten. But it demonstrates how much fear Lukashenko has of Belarusians. He needs victims every day to continue to control first of all, the repression apparatus. Because he is not controlling the country. He is controlling not a big number of thugs, of those who are real criminals, who are using violence, using force without any law, and that is why the question of impunity that was put in the report of the High Commission on Human Rights of the United Nations is the key question. We have to deprive those thugs of impunity, and then I think the window of opportunity, especially during the wartime, will open very soon.
I just want to add that if there's such an opportunity during the war in Ukraine, or when Russia is still sort of capable and stable, I think there's a potential that Russia might intervene, or we should at least ask ourselves that if there are changes politically in Belarus, what will Moscow do? Moscow is absolutely preoccupied with what's happening in Ukraine, and that's what they can muster at the moment. So possibly they won't be able to do that much in Belarus, but on the other hand, they would certainly try to do so, and that would be an immense challenge for Moscow. But that scenario is there, that they would try to intervene in some way and sort of safeguard Lukashenko's regime in some way, military also, I would say.
May I react briefly? With all due respect, that's the kind of logic that really prevented us for a long time to achieve something in Belarus, to get rid of this regime. Because what if we support Belarus strongly, Moscow will interfere? It is not the case, because, you know, and the West could help here also, sending the signals to Moscow that if you interfere, if something starts in Belarus, we'll have to cross the border. NATO will have to cross the border because it's the wartime today. Lukashenko has made already territory of Belarus a legitimate target for the Ukrainian armed forces. And there were some signals that we are watching. I agree with you completely that there is no imminent danger today from the forces, troops crossing the border from the north. But they are keeping this tension. They are keeping this tension all the time. So if Moscow wants to change the situation, being in a very difficult position today, they will have to face the consequences. So I would again, what I'm trying to message I'm trying to send. Let's start with Belarus. Let's think what we can do about Belarus to help Ukraine win the war.
And I agree, and I think this will be too much on Moscow table. That was also my point. But they will try to do something. Yeah.
So there's definitely a window. So if we go back to 24th of February 2022 and the escalation in the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war, how did Belarusians, like the civil society and young people, react to the war? We know that many Belarusians had left the country after the 2020 repressions. But what did they do? And we've seen recent attacks on this Russian plane being situated at a Belarusian airport. So how active is the resistance still within Belarus? So perhaps Maxime and Nia.
Well, I would say that it was a big shock for everyone. Maybe someone expected that the war would start, but generally it was a big shock. And I know no friends of mine who would support the war, and there are no even neutral people. They're all against, but inside Belarus and outside Belarus, all who left. But the thing is that it's very complicated to protest inside the country. There was an attempt to protest the start of the war because there was a referendum day when there were protests, and I think around 20,000 people came to the streets, and they were all arrested, or most of them. They were tortured, they were charged with administrative cases, some of them with criminal cases. So it's very complicated to do that. And those who chose a more radical approach to that, like partisans, they faced even more severe charges, like terrorism and shooting the knees. Who was one of the partisans who were shot through the knees, and now he charged, and I think he's in penal colony, if I'm not wrong. So it's very complicated to speak on what people do inside Belarus to support Ukraine, but it's much easier to speak on how people outside the country support, because a lot of them joined, as already mentioned, the forces of Ukraine to support Ukraine, to fight for Ukraine. There are a lot of volunteers at the border when there were a huge wave of emigration of Ukrainians to the European Union. A lot of them helped them, a lot of them provided with money, with clothes, with food. Also, it should be mentioned that Belarusians in exile also are in a very tough position. They don't have a lot of things, but they were ready to share it with the Ukrainians because they thought it's the right thing. I think some of them felt guilty for our state, but I don't think that we should be guilty for that. We are not supporting this. We tried to argue this, but unfortunately we couldn't do that. So Belarusians support Ukraine inside and outside the country, and with any means they can.
Thank you. Nia, would you like to comment? What are your thoughts? You are in Ukraine, and I know there are lots of lots of Belarusians not only fighting in the Kastus-Kalinovsky battalion, but also helping such as yourself. So how many Belarusians are there? What is the scope of the effort?
I cannot tell the exact number how many Belarusians, but I know that Belarusians are serving not only in Kastus-Kalinovsky regiment, but also in International Legion and Ukrainian units. So I think personally, I met maybe around 50 Belarusian soldiers in Ukraine, in person I meant, and a lot of volunteers in every city I've been to. In every village I've been to, I met at least several Belarusian volunteers who are supporting and helping Ukrainians. So basically, for Lukashenka, Lukashenka demonstrates that sovereignty for him as a Belarus is to do whatever he wants on the territory of Belarus, contrary to common sense, to international norms and law. His only belief, his only purpose is to retain his power. That's why entry of Russian troops on the territory of Belarus, it's kind of attempt to retain this power. And I may say that Belarus and Belarusian on the territory of Belarus is just hostages of the regime of dictator Lukashenka. And Lukashenka cannot stay in power without Putin's support. It's Putin's president. This is something also we're supposed to keep in mind. So, but as I repeat already, is that several Belarusians are against the war. Belarusians support Ukraine as much as they could. I know I agree with on the point that some Belarusians feeling guilty of the war, and yeah, I'm agree on this matter with Maxim. Me myself, one of the reasons I came to Ukraine because I felt this unbelievable burden of guilt that I left Ukraine, I left Belarus, I'm sorry, in 2020, when it was the most crucial time for Belarus. And out of this guilt, I believe in the beginning, I came to Ukraine. Yeah.
Thank you. Many Belarusians, and I've heard Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya mention this many times, say that Belarus is under occupation. Occupation of by Russian forces. I would like to hear your thoughts about that, and I know you have some ideas, Andrei. Perhaps you would like to share them with us.
Yeah, but first I would like also a brief remark on the previous question, because I must say that the situation is in Belarus is that of concentration camp, and to expect the meaningful uprising or resistance in the circumstances of the concentration camp will be too naive. But at the same time, and Maxim mentioned here, there were anti-war protests on the 27th of February, like three days after the war started, and they were quite massive. Yes, there was a so-called referendum, but people didn't come to the referendum. They came out to protest the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And it was an extraordinary act of courage. And the potential of resistance, the potential of anti-war movement is still there. And that is why I keep repeating that, but it needs to be helped. I promise to mention here a very interesting and very useful initiative of Libereco group, human rights group of symbolic parenthood of the political prisoners. And I would like to urge people, politicians, parliamentarians, public figures to join this initiative, because I heard that in Norway there is only one politician that is having the symbolic parenthood on as regards the political prisoner, because it is something that shows the world, that shows the regime that the world cares, that and administration, believe me, administration of colonies, I know it from my own experience, is very sensitive to such signs of solidarity and support. Another thing that I learned, to my surprise, that one of the best partners of Belarusian civil society, Norwegian Helsinki Committee, I presume other human rights and civil society organizations are not receiving any meaningful resources to support the civil society in Belarus. Civil society, independent press, and in general, the people, let's say, of democratic Belarus instead of regime, because we know that the West is pumping a lot of money from time to time into dictatorships, and civil society cannot, let's say, mount a meaningful resistance campaign without being supported. And since the possibilities inside Belarus are very limited, extremely limited, that is, I think, the obligation of the democratic world to look into this problem and find the ways to support. To answer your question, I am myself reluctant to call Belarus under occupation of Russia, because if we call it from legal point of view, it entails a lot of serious consequences. It entails the loss of independence. It will, in other words, it is the way to recognize Russia as an occupying power, which will completely change the situation from independent Belarus fighting with the pro-Kremlin regime of Lukashenka to independent Belarus being under occupation of Russian regime. Because if you look into the international law, there are very specific obligations of the occupation regime, and I'm afraid that Russia will seize this opportunity, because then it will take responsibility for Belarus if it is presented with this option. And then it will say, okay, we can even guarantee you some more rights than Lukashenko regime on the territory of Belarus. So I wouldn't play these games now. We are under occupation of our proper dictator, although he denies Belarus as a country and independence of Belarus. But it is the regime which we are fighting for being an independent country. And the opposition in Belarus, civil society of Belarus, independent press, and people of Belarus made everything to keep this independence. It is our achievement, it's not Lukashenko. Lukashenko is doing everything to sell Belarus to Kremlin. We are guarding the independence, and we want to stay independent and get rid of Lukashenko as independent Belarus.
Yes, and I might add that Russian forces are, on the Belarusian soil with the invitation from Lukashenko, and it varies the degree of Russian forces, and their main aim is to be directed towards Ukraine or trained for operations in Ukraine. But I also want to focus on the strategy document that was revealed for sort of including leaked. It was leaked for including Belarus into the Russian fold. There's been a union without that much content since 1999, as mentioned, and Moscow tried to include Belarus more and more. And with this strategy document, it reveals sort of what Moscow's ambitions are, although it has to hit the reality, as Lukashenko himself said. But it reveals what Moscow intends to do with the Belarus as a state, and that's of great concern. And I think Lukashenko might not be that eager, even though he's so dependent on Putin and Moscow, as mentioned, and certainly the Belarus people is not that eager. So hopefully that is a strategy that will be in vain.
Andrei mentioned the funding for Belarusian opposition and initiatives to promote democracy and human rights in Belarus. And from 2007, the Norwegian Parliament did actually have a Belarus strategy, which contained lots of money for Belarus, and it has since been abandoned. So this is a question for all of you, I guess. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts. What should and could the Norwegian government do in concrete measures. Support of political prisoners has been mentioned. But are there anything more we could do? And perhaps we could start with you, Nia. Yes.
Okay. I would say that there are several opportunities what I was thinking about, and first of all, it's educational programs for Ukrainian and Belarusian teachers, professional development, all kind of programs, internship for the pedagogues, so they can adopt a lot from the culture, and transporting of this Scandinavian model program of education is crucially important in order to substitute the Soviet mentality and teach Western values, meaning democratic values. So, in my view, this is like one of the most important. Also, I would say that managerial master's program for the women, such as international relations, international law, business administration, what would be grant-based for Belarusian and Ukrainian women. So this would help to promote empowerment and raising the status of women in states where the patriarchy still reigns the society. Also, temporary residence documents for those Belarusians who has no possibility to extend their Belarusian identification documents. The majority of Belarusians who are living outside Belarus may face with a problem of expired identification documents for the reason that they either don't want to acknowledge the de facto oppressive regime of Lukashenka, or sensing that they may put their life or well-being in danger of returning back to Belarus, or if they address to any de facto occupational authority in Belarus. And so these people has no possibility to extend their passport. Also, there are some number of Belarusians who are permanently living outside Belarus, but they don't want to change their citizenship. So I would suggest, kindly suggest, if it's possible, to use the Ukrainian model of temporary displaced persons, providing them such documents for the limited period of time, for instance, same for a year, but with the possibility to prolong if the regime is not falling apart. From my personal experience, I would suggest more accessible internship for everyone. Once I was a student in the University of Oslo, exchange student, I faced with a problem on finding an internship place due to the lack of Norwegian language skills of mine. Even though I have taken a language class in the university, I still wasn't accepted. I believe that providing opportunities of internship for Ukrainian and Belarusian is not only guide them in the importance of the respect of human rights at workplace, but reveal in the practice their future career perspective, what they may bring to their homeland once they return. So yeah, and I actually agree that on the matter that it's very crucial that Norway, Western countries keep the subject for those Belarusian who are living abroad up.
Thank you.
It's all from my side.
Thank you. Maxim, you're here at the Students at Risk program. Do we need more initiatives like that? Or what can we do to help Belarusians now?
Yeah, well, I would like to start with the thing that, yeah, there are a lot of initiatives that work towards some changes in Belarus, but there are also such important work as saving people. And unfortunately, or fortunately, money is a crucial thing for that work. So I would say that, yeah, I would say that funding is very important for civil society organizations, because we don't ask to save some people, we just ask us to provide resources for us to save ourselves. And I would say that there are some, the European Union fundings for civil society, but they're not really transparent. And this money, I don't know how they spread among civil society organizations, and that's a very important issue. So I would say that different funding organizations in Norway, maybe in the European Union, it's better for them to work directly with the civil society organizations, with NGO, those who work with Belarusians directly, those who can save them, those who can educate them, those who can make some difference for them. And if we speak about students and Students at Risk program, I would say it's a wonderful program, it's a wonderful initiative, and limiting to Norway, I think that's more than enough for Belarusian students, because there is a language barrier and it's a very different culture from us, and the demand is not so big. But the thing that can be made is lobbying for launching such a program at the European Union level, so that as more countries as possible launch this program at the national levels, so that not only Belarusians but other students at risk from other authoritarian countries could have this opportunity to get this education here, to learn something new, to find their path, and maybe in future to come back to their countries and to contribute to the democratic changes in their countries. And I would say that after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there were some reactions of some member states of the European Union that are kind of discriminatory, and it's much harder for Belarusians in Belarus to leave the country, unfortunately. And it would be nice if at the European Union level, at the Schengen zone level, there were some mechanisms to make the process of leaving the country easier. I mean, providing some humanitarian visas much faster than like 15 days as it is now, because unfortunately for some people, they don't have enough time to spend it in Belarus, because they might be arrested at any time, at any moment, and there are not so many ways to leave the country now, because earlier it was Ukraine, but now there is war in Ukraine. With Poland, there is a wall, and most of the ways out are closed now. There is Lithuania, but there are some limitations there. Russia is not an option anymore, and all other options are so expensive, because the flights are like up to 500 euros. So such mechanism for those who are at risk, who might be arrested, would be very helpful to save these lives.
Thank you. Time is running up, but I would like just finally to ask one last question. If we are to sanction anyone, whom are we to sanction, and in what way? We talked a little bit. You've talked a little bit about sanctions, but could you go a little bit more in detail? How should we sanction, and what individuals, and should we sanction Russia to stop human rights violations in Belarus? How are those things interlinked? So, Andrei.
It's rather. Stop.
This one.
Yeah. It's kind of tricky. Not whom, but what. I'm not, Belarus is different from Russia. If you sanction Russian officials or oligarchs or anybody, they have their assets and their money in Europe and in the United States. In Belarus, the officials don't keep their money in Europe. So it is just visa restriction, a travel restriction for them. So you have to first close all the loopholes, because there are a lot of them, and still the export from Belarus into Europe is growing, despite all the sanctions. And the countries that are the strongest supporters of sanctions, like Lithuania and Poland, still demonstrate the growth of export from Belarus. So I don't know what is the reason, but I think it has to be stopped. Besides, Belarus is used as a smuggling hub for Russia to avoid sanctions that are imposed on Russia. There are examples of very effective sanctions, like Poland has blocked the traffic railroad and road traffic from Belarus into Belarus because of the treatment of activists and our friends and colleagues from the Union of Poles, Belarusians who are part of democracy movement, Andrzej Poczobut, Angelika Boris and others. And it was effective because it hurts not only the interests of Lukashenko, but first of all of Russia and China, because they're the most convenient way from China to Europe through Belarus, because all other options are closed. So you don't have to be a very knowledgeable and very smart to see where to put pressure, but it is needed.
Okay. So time has unfortunately run up. Let me say thank you to Andrei, Tom, Nia, and Maxim, and I know that you would like to say some concluding words. Please.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we have this room for some more time. So if there is an interest in some questions from the audience, and you guys are able to stay here for, let's say, 15 more minutes, and you can handle it maybe, that might be a good idea.
I'm running off to another meeting,
You
but
are.
I could stay. I have to be in Drammen, but I could stay for 15 more minutes. Yes.
Okay.
I would be interested to hear more about many things. For instance, you mentioned China, but perhaps we should have a few questions from the audience.
Yes.
If there are any.
Yes, I think we could have 2 or 3 questions from the audience. So, there's one there, please. Could you please give the name and wherever you work?
My name is Sigurd Lydersen, representing a little group from the civic society which we call the Norwegian Democracy Movement. I must say it was very interesting to hear the introduction by Sannikov and especially this criticism in the direction of the West, where we are now. I would like Sannikov to elaborate a bit on that part, because what Sannikov presents is the opposite narrative from what we get from this Russian propaganda. Because the Russian propaganda says that the West is very active. That is the West which is the moving force in this conflict. So I think it's important to make this point and make it clear. It's a very important point to show. It's also my impression as a philologist and as an expert of Russian language and following the situation in Ukraine from the Orange Revolution, that it's quite opposite. And I am very frustrated personally by how every day this Russian propaganda is presented and naively and critically reproduced in our medias. So this is the case. And why is this, Andrei? This is also interesting to hear. Not only pointing out that we are too naive, too ignorant.
Okay.
We don't
question,
hear. So that's my very important question, and I'm very happy for this possibility to pose it. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, why are we so
ignorant here in the West?
So why are we so ignorant?
Yes.
Who feels ignorant enough to?
You are not ignorant. You are living very comfortably, protected. Your well-being is quite well guarded. You have human rights. You have your own dignity. You are developing very fast. You are a prosperous society. And you don't want to learn the lessons. And I used to joke, but it's no joke anymore, that the club of the surprised analysts and strategists is being expanded. They started from '91, when they were very surprised with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We saw it coming, but all the Western analysts were extremely surprised. and George Bush, the senior, guided by this analyst, came to Kiev and spoke against Ukrainian nationalism, trying to prevent the separation from the Soviet Union of such an important country as Ukraine. And it keeps going on. Look, I can give you very specific examples. The crackdown of 2010 was financed by the West, because on the eve, in 2009, Lukashenko got 3 billion credit from IMF. And that money was used to buy equipment for the police, to train police in Germany. There were training courses for the police, not for the police, but for those thugs, for criminals in Germany. They got equipment. The crackdown of 2020 was financed by the West. Why? Because in 2015, European Union lifted all the sanctions of Lukashenko regime, despite the fact that conditions on which these sanctions were introduced were not met. Sanctions were lifted, and probably somebody remembers that the money flow continued, the smuggling operations continued, and the politicians on the level of prime ministers, foreign ministers, suddenly all rushed to praise Lukashenko for his, I don't know what they found in him, I don't know. We know him quite well, and we don't see anything that he could be praised for in the country. And he got enough money to buy whatever is possible. You probably don't know, but I can tell you that during the protests, the hand grenades, stun grenades used were made in Czechia, rubber bullets were made in Poland, the water cannons were made in Canada by Canadian company. Of course, it was owned by Russian, but by origin, but it is based in Canada. The surveillance software were made by American companies, so they all contributed to the crackdown. The question is not to me. The question is to the people who are taking these decisions. And to the why I'm always pleased and encouraged to discuss Belarus in any audience, and I'm always pleased with such questions, because it is up to you to put pressure on your politicians to stop it. And I think that if you start paying more attention to Belarus from the point of view that I presented, that it is extremely strategically important for Europe and for Norway as well, you can find it very rewarding to achieve something. And not much effort is needed to put the Belarus in the right perspective and try to influence the policy in any European country. Like Arvin mentioned, that there was a strategy on Belarus. Why it is no more? Why there is no such strategy anymore in Norway? It is very important for us to engage with you in a dialogue, for the opposition, for the democratic society of Belarus, to engage in all kinds of dialogue, because, believe me, we are on the threshold of reforms. We are on the threshold of real freedom, and we need input from outside, first of all, to get rid of the regime, and then to help us to develop.
So what will happen if the Lukashenko regime collapses? What are the possibilities?
You know something?
Well, it is a possibility. There are so many things happening on all levels in Belarus and in Russia, and the war in Ukraine is just aggravating all of these factors. And suddenly something may happen at any point, anywhere, which starts some kind of spiral. And we don't know that. We don't know where it might start, we don't know how it might end, but what will happen if Lukashenko is to suddenly disappear? Will Belarus suddenly turn democratic? It's kind of an open question. How do you envision the transfer from the Lukashenkian regime to something else, and what is that something else?
I don't like the word sudden. And the question is not what would happen. It will happen. It will happen sooner than some of us expect. The question is, are we ready for that? Not yet. And that is why I'm telling you that we have to be prepared. I can tell you only one thing, why the collapse of Putin regime will be different from collapse of Lukashenko regime, or collapse of Lukashenko regime will be different from Putin. Because in Russia there are still many groups that are sharing the power, and military, oligarchs. In Belarus, the system is centered around one person. If this person is withdrawn, disappears, the system is collapsing inevitably. And we have to be ready. That is the question. It is what will sudden, I don't like the word sudden, I don't like the word, okay, let's wait and hope for a miracle. No, miracle will not happen. We'll have to create the miracle. And that's what we are discussing today.
I can provide a possible optimistic scenario. Spring offensive, counteroffensive from the Ukrainians. They're trying to prepare for that. They might be able to muster a well-organized, mechanized counteroffensive in the south in April. And if they do so, they might manage to threaten Crimea. And that would create some dynamics in Moscow, possibly some absolutely strong criticism, and possibly also some more unstable Russia. And that could absolutely inflict on Belarus and create more room for maneuver in Belarus for the opposition and also for outside support. So that's something that can happen. I mean, how this war turns is difficult to say, but that's certainly one possible scenario.
What do you think? You mentioned institutions building up, using programs such as the Students at Risk to learn, to train a new generation of youth to be able to take the positions and create a new, better society. So, what are your expectations?
Well, first of all, I hope that there will be a transitional justice in Belarus, and it will be just, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I don't really think that there was any kind of transitional justice, or at least it was very subtle. And it's very important to have it, just to show the society that the new government, that the new state won't make the same mistakes, that the state won't make the same awful things as the previous one did. And I also hope very much that me as a representative of youth, I hope that youth will be included in all decision-making processes and in all the discussions on all very important issues, because unfortunately now there is a lot of ageism among even democratic leaders towards young people, that we are incompetent, that we don't know, well, we don't know anything. And I hope the situation will change. And this is why we exist as youth organizations, as students organizations. We advocate for that. We talk about that, that we are competent, that we have knowledge, that we have ideas how we can change. And yeah, in my dream, I expect that in Belarus there will be a lot of youth initiatives that will work towards improvement of our country, of our state. Yeah, and when the regime falls, I expect that I will come back home as soon as possible and lie on my bed, because I don't really appreciate it so much in my life. Now I will. And yeah, and as I've mentioned, transitional justice and youth in all the reform processes.
Perhaps you would like to comment, finally, what are your hopes and expectations for the future of Belarus, Nia?
Thank you very much. I think that future in Belarus, new legislation supposed to be written in Belarus, what would be in compliance with democratic Western values, democratic and human rights values in Belarus. And I truly also want to participate in the drafting of new legislation for free Belarus, and where human rights would be on the top of everything, where human rights would be respected, where people would be treated equally, where I want to live in the country where your opinion of a human being is. So I would like to see this world, and also I really want to return to Belarus. Sadly, I cannot return there until regime of Lukashenka falls.
So thank you to all of our panelists for coming here today to talk about Belarus and to talk about possible solutions. So warm hand of applause to all of them.
And thank you for attending this seminar. Don't wait for miracles, create them. During my lifetime, we have gotten rid of 9, 10, 11, 3 fascist dictatorships and 8, 9 communist dictatorships in our own part of the world. We should be able to get rid of a couple more during our lifetime. So again, thank you for coming. Thanks a lot to the panelists. Thanks a lot to you doing the work on the ground in Ukraine. And people have met each other, pick up the rest of the food, talk, and then we will leave, and I will hand out some stuff to our dear panelists. Thank you all.